Good evening, all. Thank you for joining us tonight. My name is Carrie Jean Mixa. I am the current chair of the Indiana Coalition for Public Education, Monroe County. ICPE is you. We are you. We are community members that care and advocate for public education because public education serves all children. ICPE is nonpartisan. ICPE is grassroots. ICPE Monroe County's operating budget is less than $5,000 each year. We are indeed David, and we are versus a lot of Goliaths. We have the Waltons of Walmart and Reed Hastings of Netflix just in these past few months donating yet again hundreds of thousands of dollars to education PACs in Indiana, and those PACs fund legislators and school board candidates that will vote to privatize public education further. Our government has been taken hostage by billionaires who don't want to pay their fair share of taxes and don't necessarily believe in the common good. And yet, from the funding perspective, our $5,000 operating budget, our tiny advocacy group is David. We could be bigger. If we had more members, you could join us. But in reality, we support an education Goliath. We support public schools. Almost 90% of children in Indiana attend traditional public schools. Parents believe and trust in public schools and public school teachers. They believe in community. Public schools unify and are full of tradition and amazing things. For example, Unionville Elementary, just up the road by Lake Lemon, celebrated its 100th birthday this spring. That's a lot of tradition and a lot of history. While our legislators continue to float legislation that divides, right now up on the square there's a protest going on about Roe versus Wade, we must hold tight to our public schools that unite us and demand full funding for these schools. Michael Hicks, economist from Ball State, who was quoted once again in an article in the HT this weekend, has pointed out in a report how Indiana's inflation-adjusted spending per K-12 student was 17% lower in 2020 than it was in 2010. Hold tight to that tidbit because we're talking about taxes and funding tonight. On to this event. This is the third of a series of events titled The Power of Public Education. This one is an informational session about taxes. We're going to lift the veil tonight and examine how tax dollars pay for our children's education. It is in no way simple, and there may be a few surprises for some. We have invited Dr. Michele Moore. She is one of these rare experts in the field. I know a couple, and I wish they all spoke up more because they know so much. There is a group of school financial experts that help bail out school districts that are underwater, near underwater financially in this state. And often this is due to a host of factors, many of which are out of their control. Dr. Moore has worked with school districts for over 23 years. She has been superintendent for over 5 years in Martinsville and Shelby Eastern. She has served for 2 years as Executive Director and CFO of Central Indiana Educational Service Center. She has prepared budgets, conducted superintendent and board training, and consulted in the area of school finance. A licensed CPA since 1995, she has worked as a field examiner with the State Board of Accounts and in private practice consulting with nonprofits and individuals. She has a doctorate in educational leadership and curriculum from Indiana University and a PS in finance from the Kelley School of Business. You are very, very talented. Oh my goodness. Dr. Moore's expertise is in financial management for schools, understanding and working in declining enrollment and updating curriculum and student programs for the demands of the 21st century. So how this evening will run. It's pretty simple. Dr. Moore, a very gifted lecturer, will handle any question as we go along. I don't really have to moderate, but I will walk the room and be sure all your questions are answered. I will have a little microphone so you can speak into it so it gets captured on the CATS recording. So let's get this show on the road.
All right.
Dr. Moore.
Thanks. She talked a little bit about me. I'll just say I'm crazy. So that's probably the first thing you need to know. I love public schools, and I've been in public schools my whole life. I graduated from public school. Then I went to a public university, so that's my background. That's where I am, if you want to know what I believe or what I think. I am kind of weird, though, because I have this undergraduate degree in finance, and then I went to education, so I'm not touchy-feely, warm, soft, and cuddly by any stretch of the imagination. So we're just going to jump right into it. Where do schools get their money? And the first thing you need to understand in order to understand school finance is they use something called fund accounting. And this is what everything else hinges on, because if you don't understand fund accounting, you're never going to understand school finance. And I have superintendents that I've worked with for probably 10 years, and they still don't understand fund accounting, and they still don't understand school finance. And so if you understand fund accounting, I'm sorry that we're going to go way back to the building blocks, but I think it's a good refresher for anybody who gets into it. You just have to remember that in fund accounting, there are buckets. And the revenue goes into a bucket, and it can't go into another bucket. It can only go into that one bucket. And in Indiana, we've basically got 4 funds that we're gonna talk about. Now, if you ask for a fund report for a school system in Indiana, it's probably going to be 5 to 10 pages long. And you're probably going to see up to 100 funds on that report. But most of those funds we don't care about today. We're not going to talk about federal grant funds, state grant funds, local scholarship funds, all of that stuff. We don't care. We're going to talk about the big 4. That's where probably 90% of your income comes into play. Your tax dollars, and your money from the state, which we'll call pass-through dollars, and we'll talk about that here in a second. So we have education, we have operations, we have debt service, and we have referendum. And those are the big funds that you're going to be seeing talked about. We're going to talk about each one of those individually. I talk fast, so I can talk more. And I've learned that when I was a classroom teacher, that you just keep going and then their head's spinning. But if you have a question, just raise your hand and we'll go through it again. It's real informal, real conversational. There's no stupid questions in this room because it's all confusing. And I guarantee you that if you have the question, there's probably 50 school superintendents that have the same question. They're just too embarrassed to let you know. So the question everybody wants is, it's my tax dollars, right, that I fund public education. And I can't tell you how many times I've gone to budget hearings when I was a superintendent or when I conduct and teach my school finance class at IU. And people say, but my tax dollars pay for your teacher's salary. And I'm like, nope, they don't. They don't pay for your teacher's salary. We're going to look at each bucket separately, and you're going to see that probably 94% of the salary and benefits that are going to run through a school system for classroom expenses are not going to be paid for with any property tax dollars. And that's because it gets paid out of the education fund. So in Indiana, the education fund pays for all expenses directly tied to the classroom. And that's where you're going to have all your teacher salary and benefits. You'll have your principal salary and benefits, classroom supplies, classroom aides. So if you have a classroom aide, they'll probably get paid out of the education fund. But you need to know what kind of teacher's aide it is, okay? Because if it's a special education aide, it's probably being paid out of a state grant fund. And if it is another kind of, like a computer tech aide, they very well might be being paid out of the operations fund. So you're going to have different kinds of people based on their job descriptions, not necessarily the title aide. And so understand that. You also have other expenses that are going to be directly tied to students. And that's going to be Chromebook expenses maybe, or STEM equipment, library materials, guidance counselors, social workers. All those people can be paid out of the education fund. And this gets a little tricky for you because not only when you get a bill, say Monroe County Schools gets a bill for Chromebooks, they need to look at not only the purchase, but who it was purchased for. So it's going to be an education expense if we paid for it and it goes to the students in the classroom, or if it goes to classroom teachers. But then if those same Chromebook bill is actually to buy laptops for the business office so they can work remotely, that's going to come out of a different fund. So you can't look at a bill and assume you know what it's being paid for or what it's being paid out of. You have to ask a lot of questions and do a lot of digging. And there's also a lot of coding. In Indiana, they use a uniform numbering system. And so for total numbers geeks like me, we can look at any bill and tell you the fund it was paid out of, the account, and then what kind of expense it is. And so that's something that when I teach my school finance class to principals and superintendents at IU, one of the things that we look at is learning how to code, because it's easier to look at those numbers to see how it's accounted for than actually looking at the invoice sometimes. So education fund has to be directly tied to the school or the classroom. I want you to remember that. The surprising thing is that money, most of it, now I always say most because there are always nuances in school finance. And there's always exceptions, and there's always other money that flows in, but we're not going to worry about that. The vast majority of the money that you get comes from the state, and that comes from income taxes and sales taxes. I'm going to show you a graph that illustrates that. So this is the Indiana state source for revenue. And you're going to notice that sales and use taxes is almost 47% of the state budget. So the money that comes in comes from our consumption as consumers. We like to buy stuff. And every time you buy a car or you buy, some non-perishable grocery items that get taxed, that stuff, it's all going to be sales and use tax. You go to the shopping mall and buy, that $100 pair of jeans, sales and use tax. It goes to the state budget, and that's going to get divvied up and sent back to schools. And I'll show you a graph about that here in a second. And then the next thing you need to know is you'll see that other wedge, and it's almost 39% is Indiana income taxes. So Indiana income taxes are the other piece, and that is the tax on the revenues that you pay. And I want you to understand those funding sources, because when you understand the funding sources, you're going to understand some of the political arguments that swirl around the legislature. Now, I think of the legislature like a toilet, You flush it, and it swirls and swirls and swirls, and some stuff finally settles at the bottom. Okay, that's the legislature. And I want you to understand how that works, the funding sources, because then you're going to understand why some of our school districts that are suburban school districts that have affluent communities, why they've been advocating politically for an increase in the base amount per student. And the reason is because in their communities, they pay a lot of income tax and they pay a lot of sales tax because they're high wage earners and they consume a lot. And in their mind, they want all that money to go to their students because it's us versus them in a lot of communities. And so that's a really important thing for you to understand, that mindset, because that's going to drive a lot of school funding at the legislative level. It's very important to understand. And there's a conflict right now between a lot of the suburban districts that want a level amount per student and a lot of the urban and rural communities that want extra money for what they call complexity, which is students in poverty. Because we know urban areas and we know rural areas have higher poverty rates a lot of times. So you might have a suburban community that has 20% students in poverty. You might have a nearby urban area that might have 70, and you might have a rural community in the southern part of the state that might have 70% poverty. And those students in the past got extra money in complexity to account for their students in poverty. And the legislature, the last 10 to 15 years, has reduced that complexity funding, and they've given more per student. So if you're in an affluent area with growing enrollment, you've gotten a lot of cash lately. And you can drive around the urban rings, so the suburban ring around any of the major areas in the state. Drive around Fort Wayne, drive around Indianapolis, drive around Evansville, and visit some of those communities, and you're going to see some wow. You're going to see some amazing facilities, athletic facilities that might rival Division III, football stadiums. You'll see lots of amazing state-of-the-art science labs. And then I would challenge you to drive 50 miles in any direction in the northern part of the state or the southern part of the state in a really rural area that's a school of less than 1,000 students and look at their facilities. And that's all going to be tied to this particular graph. So this is probably the most important graph for you to understand philosophically about school funding. And that is sales tax and income taxes fund the education fund. And because of that paradigm shift, that has given rise to the voice in a lot of suburban areas that they should have more dollars for their students because they pay more dollars. So then, how does Indiana divvy up its budget? We just talked about the revenue side. Let's talk about the expense side. The big expense, 50% of the Indiana budget, K-12 education. Now, K-12 education covers a lot. It covers public schools, it covers charter schools, and it covers choice vouchers, which go to private schools. And we'll talk about those dollars separately. But again, education fund, it's the big lift in all school budgets. It pays for all of the school level expenditures, including teacher salaries and principal salaries. That's all going to come out of the state budget, funded with sales tax and income taxes, and that accounts for about 50 cents of every dollar that gets paid into the state gets paid back out to K-12. So back in 2008, they changed the law, and they went to this system. Before that, schools were funded based on property taxes. And if you were in education back in the dark ages, when I was, because I'm old, you learned that property taxes were wonderful things because they weren't sexy. I mean, they didn't go up all the time and go down all the time and all that fun stuff, but they were stable because even if people lost their jobs, most of the time they still paid their property tax bill. So we loved them because you could build your budget and you kind of knew from year to year what you had coming in. And then we decided in 2008 that we're going to pull that rug out from underneath everybody. And we're going to move to what I call sexy school finance. And that is sales tax and income tax. Because they're great when the economy is booming. They go up. Everybody's making money. You're paying more income taxes. The more money you make, the more stuff you buy. You're paying more sales taxes. So they're wonderful things when it's a great economy. And then when you get into a recession, what's the first thing people stop doing? They stop buying stuff. You don't buy that brand new fridge you've had your eyes on. You don't buy that brand new car that you had your eye on. You start buying more food. Now inflation, more people their budget's going to food, which in Indiana we don't tax. So there's going to be less sales tax collected. So then schools get hit in the crunch because they don't get as much. So these are two things that I think it's really important for you to understand about school finance, and that is the dollars per student, and I want you to understand that how they're not really what we call stable dollars. Because when you go into economic downturns, your income stream is going to drop. And so you're going to see that frequently. If we're heading into, I won't use the R word because it's a bad word. In economists, they don't like that word. I won't use that word. But if we're going into a downturn or heading that way with higher inflation, stock market's off, interest rates are rising, then we could see where we're going to be going into a situation where we're not going to have as much of a pie available in sales tax and income taxes to fund schools. And that is going to hit the education fund budget. So remember that too. It's not going to hit the budgets we're going to talk about next. It's only going to hit the education fund. And what's it going to hit if it's the education fund? It's going to hit teacher salaries. So education's tied to ADM. That's the other main pillar of school finance everyone needs to understand. And that stands for average daily membership. That just means belly buttons and seats. So the average public school gets $6,342 per student. That used to vary widely. It used to be this huge range, because of complexity, because of money that schools got, the bonus money for students in poverty. And now they're shrinking that gap. So the average is about $6,342, and it varies, it's quite small how much that range is. So it's tied to average daily membership. That's why if you're a growing district, you have lots of cash because you get more money every budget year, and you can depend on that money. And you depend on that money to fund teacher salary increases. Now, if you're a rural district or an urban district and you're losing money, the most important thing to know is that your pie isn't getting any bigger. And you're probably having to cut because your pie is getting smaller. And there's no more painful place to be in than to have to cut. Because you're going to do a couple of things. You're going to either downsize your schools by closing buildings, and I closed a building when I was superintendent. I can promise you that does not make you person of the year in your community. People do not like that. It is not popular at all. And if you don't have the political stomach for that, then you're probably going to pay your teachers crap. Okay? Because that's your options, because your pie's getting smaller. So if you look in rural communities and you see, or even in urban communities, and their teachers don't make a lot of money, it's probably because they're paying to keep buildings open because they are not willing to do what needs to be done in order to pay their teachers. And that is a really hard conversation to have with communities because we are in love with buildings in Indiana. Our buildings represent our ego, and they represent our past, and we flourish in it. Indiana, one of the last 2 states to move to daylight savings time. And what does that tell us? That tells us we don't like change. No way, Jose. Nothing. No change ever in Indiana. And so that follows through. We love to keep buildings open where they have a very small number of elementary kids because grandma and grandpa and mom and dad went to that building and they have memories tied to buildings. And I will tell anyone that we are shortchanging our children today because we are not willing to make decisions about physical buildings. And that is a hard thing. And it does not make you popular, but I think it's something that has to be said. So $6,300 is what you get per kid. The education fund, about 94% of that is going to be made up of salary and benefits for most schools. Some schools are going to be a little less. They'll be down into the high 80s, low 90s. Some schools are going to be higher. I've had a school I worked with that went as high as 98%. Okay, that just depends on the district where you are, but a normal range is going to be about 93 to 94%, and that's going to be salaries and benefits. And that's why if schools lose money, they cut teachers. They can have money coming in for property taxes, and they can't use that money to pay for teacher salaries. So if you're in declining enrollment, you're also going to be in a situation where you're either cutting teachers or cutting teacher salaries or not giving pay raises. So that's another thing that's really important to remember. There also is another rule that Indiana's had to deal with the last few years, and it's called funding to the classroom. And this is, you can call it a dog and pony show or smoke and mirrors. I think they both apply. And This is a rule that says that 45% of your state funding that you get from the state for your students has to go to direct funding of classroom teacher salaries. Because everybody lives in this pipe dream that we're not putting enough dollars to the classroom, is what everybody says. So we'll just make you do it. 45% has to go to the classroom. Well, what they forgot to tell you is this doesn't include any teacher benefits. So if you're a district that has always paid a lot of health insurance for teachers, maybe you have $1 insurance on the single plan, so teachers can get the insurance for $1, and you use that as a marketing and recruitment tool for your teaching staff, doesn't count in the 45 base. So yes, while you might have a low actual salary, your teachers make more because they get great free benefits. Or I won't call them free, but they get a good benefit package. You know, the school might be paying over $20,000 towards your family plan. They might be paying all but $1 of your single plan. And so those schools suddenly are not meeting this 45% rule, and the state's telling them they're not funding teacher salaries when they really are if you include benefits. Benefits need to be part of this calculation, I'm sorry. It's part of the compensation package. It also doesn't include any career tech teachers or special education teachers last year if they were in co-ops. So if you're in Monroe County, I think it's Hoosier Hills, if I remember right, is your co-op. None of those teacher salaries counted for any of the other schools. So if Spencer Owen sends voc ed students to Monroe County for CTE, none of those teacher salaries, the portion that Spencer Owen pays, counts towards Spencer Owen's 45% rule. And that's problematic. They addressed it, the legislature did this year. I'll give them the benefit of that. They addressed it, and starting in July, special education teachers in a co-op will get prorated benefits to the districts. But they didn't for CTE. That still needs to be fixed. And then it also includes a bunch of people that I think are absolutely paramount to the schools. But they're not in the classroom, so their salaries don't count. And that's guidance counselors, librarians, and social workers, and instructional coaches. And I think these people are a key to success in schools. I don't want to see a school that doesn't have social workers and guidance counselors and librarians and instructional coaches. Yep?
I'd like to ask about the role of federal funding now, when you're talking about these categories. Let's say federal funding is 6 to 8% of whatever goes. You also have major projects like the American Relief Package and the Infrastructure Package, and concern about counselors now and some of the federal funding. So what role does the federal funding give? If you don't have the complexity funds coming from the state, what role does the federal fund come in? What role does the place state in using those federal funds?
Okay, that's a really good question, and it's twofold. There's the traditional federal funds that schools have always gotten for a long time, and that for most schools is free and reduced lunch money, title money, so Title I, II, and IV for most schools, which is to intervention funds to help students who come into poverty, or teacher professional development is what you're going to see. And there's also what we call a Part B funding, which is special education. So extra money to help students who are special needs. So those funds schools have always relied on, and they pay for things like special education teachers and title and that. ESSER money, which is the COVID relief money that a lot of school districts have used, I think are great, and they are the lifeline schools needed for a very short period of time, but it's going away. It's not permanent. So I think once it runs out in, I think 2024 is the last of it will be spent, you're going to see a big fiscal cliff for a lot of school districts because they've experienced declining enrollment during COVID, and they haven't rebounded fully to where they were, and they hired support staff, and they're paying for them through that grant money, particularly counselors and social workers, which I think are so necessary. We had a Lilly grant when I was a superintendent, and that was $250,000. It was the most powerful money we had because we were able to put social workers and counselors in schools to help kids. Because honestly, kids are suffering. There are a lot of mental health issues with kids, and a kid is not going to learn if a kid doesn't feel safe and have their mental health issues addressed. And so it is really important, those, counselors and social workers, they have a role in the school, and those funding dollars are particularly important. But I can't foresee the future, but based on past experiences and what I know of school financial statements, I really think there's a lot of schools that would have been at a fiscal cliff earlier if they hadn't had that money. But I think when that goes away, you're going to see a lot of.
So the Black Lives Matter in schools says counselors, not cops in the schools. So where are the cops in all of this? And who's funding them? And what funds are there for the counselors rather than for the cops?
Okay, that's another good question. Police departments are paid for out of the operations fund 9 times out of 10, although Indiana has a quirky rule that allows you to run a public safety referendum. And so you could run a referendum and actually pay for a local police force for your school district. Now, I'm going to give you just a big caveat. I don't want you to get me talking about this topic too much, because I do have to drive from my house to Mooresville and not get pulled over with a parking ticket. So that's all I'm going to say about that for now. Supplies. Everybody hates this, and people who move from out of state to Indiana are like, this is the craziest thing they've ever heard of when they go to back to school night and they get a $250 bill for each kid. So you got 3 kids, you're going to be pushing $1,000 in some districts. And that is, Indiana, you pay for your supplies, your textbooks. That's just the way it's always been. But again, hey, we'll be the last 2 states standing, and we'll still be paying for it. The only exception is if the kid is on free and reduced lunch, they get free textbooks. You submit a voucher to the state in the fall, and you get reimbursed for part of that. The part that you don't get reimbursed for, you actually can levy on your debt service in your taxes. And so you'll see that. You'll see unreimbursed textbooks on the budget for debt service, and people always wonder what that is. And that is just for your students in poverty, the unpaid portion of that bill that wasn't reimbursed from the state. You get to levy on your property taxes. And for most places, it's not a whole lot of money. It might, in relation to everything else, it's not that much. Tax rates. This is the fun stuff. This is what everybody thinks school finance is all about. And we are 33 minutes into the talk, and we're just not getting to property taxes. So that gives you an idea. It really isn't that important like it used to be in 2008 and before. So you have 3 main funds that you levy taxes on: operations, debt service, and referendum. Some schools still have what I call a hangover, and that is a pension debt fund. I don't want to go into the nuances of that because almost all of them are on the downward swing, and they'll be paid off in the next 4 or 5 years if they haven't already been paid off. So let's talk about operations. Now we get to talk about property taxes. This is the main source of revenue for the operations fund is your property tax settlement. And it comes from the property owners in the tax district. Monroe County Schools gets 31 cents, 31.98. We go up 4 decimal places in school finance, so decimals do matter. So about 32 cents in the operations tax rate is what you're going to see for their budget. The interesting thing is those budget amounts, when they redid this whole system, were locked at a dollar amount, and you can only increase your operations fund budget every year by a certain amount that is tied to net assessed valuation increases. So you're never going to see this. You're never going to have, so like Monroe County might say, you know, we've got several older buildings and we need to, we have more maintenance costs. And we need to raise an extra $2 million to pay for the building maintenance. We have a chiller that's going out in a building and a cooling tower and an HVAC system. And we need to redo the roof on one of our schools. So we need to generate an extra $1 million. And so let's raise our tax rate. Well, no. Department of Local Government Finance is going to tell you how much you can raise your tax rate. And you're going to have a max that you can levy. And every year, about July, they're going to send you a notice, and it's going to tell you how much you get to collect in taxes based on that complicated formula. And I'm not going to go into that formula because it's boring. It makes me cry, and I like numbers. It would probably make you walk out of the room, and so we're going to not go there. But just know that you're set. That number, that 31.98 cents, might be able to edge up a tiny little bit, but it's not going to be able to go up very, very much. And it's all tied to how much AV moves in a particular area. It's going to pay for what I like to call school overhead. And that's going to be superintendent's office, transportation, building maintenance, including your custodians, capital improvements, and equipment. So, inflation rising. Which fund gets hit? Operations. Operations fund, that's the one where it's really going to take an impact for inflation because you're going to see utility costs increase. You're going to see supply costs for janitorial supplies increase, fuel cost through the roof, transportation to buy new buses, those costs go up. If you can find buses, I was talking to a school and they ordered new buses last October, and it is now May 9th and they have yet to see a bus. And that is because of the chip shortage. So Bluebird in Tennessee has an entire football field parking lot full of buses that are built waiting for chips. And so all of these costs are going into the operations fund. So you're finding operations funds are very, very tight in a lot of districts because their overhead costs are rising, and the money to pay for that is tied to property taxes, and how much they can increase it is locked. So you need more money. You can't increase your property taxes. I want you to remember that. You need more money for operations because your overhead's going up. And you can't increase your tax rate legally because it's tied to this net AV growth. So what's your option? And we're going to talk about that in a minute. Debt service fund. Another one that's paid for with property taxes. Monroe County's debt rate is 21.3 cents. Okay? And your debt service fund is borrowed money. It is your school mortgage. So you're going to have a mortgage. It's going to pay for buildings and building improvements. And there's two main types. There's one called GO bonds. For a long time in school finance, when I was really young, I thought they were called GO bonds. I had no idea they stood for general obligation. I'm just like, woo, go get a bond. But I learned that they're small issues. There's a complicated formula in tax in the Indiana Code that they're limited to. And you're going to see them for, maybe a $1 million, $2 million, $3 million issues. And so you're going to pay for maintenance and small upgrades for roofs. You'll do a section of a roof maybe, or an HVAC system, or just general building maintenance is what you'll see the GO bonds used for. And then you also have lease rentals. And lease rentals are these large issues for new buildings or for major renovations. They're much more complicated to do. Sometimes they can involve a petition remonstrance, which is basically a petition drive between people who want to have the property increase and for people who are against it. Sometimes they're also tied into a referendum. And we saw a few of those referendums last week in the primary. I think there were 9, 7 passed, and 2 didn't. Debt service does not pay for salary, wages, or benefits. And this is so important. I cannot tell you how many times I've gone to mediate a teacher contract and dispute, and the teachers union is so upset because they just astroturfed the football field and they can't give teachers a pay raise. And every time I have to say, I get it. It stinks, it's awful, but they can do that because they have borrowed money, and that can pay for facility improvements. You cannot pay for any wages, salaries, or benefits with your bond money. It's forbidden under law. So this is a really hard thing to understand, but it's crucial that you understand what can be paid out of what. Because it gets us to our next funding source, which is pretty new in Indiana, and that is referendum funds. To understand referendums, you need to understand property tax caps, meaning that our operations fund can't increase the tax rate just because we want to, and that the debt service fund, you can't pay for teacher salary and wages out of it, okay? So you've got these caps that you can't spend money on. You want to give more money to the classroom, to teacher salaries. You maybe want to hire police officers, or you maybe want to renovate the STEM labs in all of your schools, or maybe you want to add on an auditorium for performing arts, or maybe you want to build a new state-of-the-art career tech center. What are you going to do? You're going to have a referendum. It's outside the property tax caps. It's approved by voters, and it can be one of two different types of questions. It can be an operating referendum, which pays for teacher salaries or police officer salaries or somebody's salaries, usually not the superintendent or the principal. I've not seen that yet. I've seen guidance counselors, social workers, all those positions. Or you have a capital referendum. Capital referendum is for building improvements. I think Franklin Township and Vigo County both had capital referendums that were defeated last week, and those were for major renovations in both of those school districts. So let's look at a real example close to you. Why would Monroe County need a referendum? Okay? And I think that's a really good question. Some schools need them and some schools don't. Sometimes it's easier to run a referendum than to cut. Sometimes you're a small school and you want to keep your doors open and you don't want to consolidate, so you run a referendum. And that gives you the extra money you need to handle your declining enrollment, and you don't have to consolidate with the Bulldogs or the Hawks or the Tritons from next door. That we see that all the time. If you look at the referendums that passed last election, you're going to see a couple of really small schools on that list, and that's why. So, Monroe County, 8th lowest tax rate in the state. You had a really low debt service rate and a really low operations rate when the rules changed. And remember, you can't just increase the rate because you want to. That's just not how it works. And so you're competing also with suburban Indianapolis for teachers in a teacher shortage. You don't want a Tier 3 teacher. You want an IU School of Education teacher graduate from our stellar flagship university teaching your students. I'm a little biased for the cream and crimson. And you're going to have to pay because in Marion County and the suburban counties surrounding it, starting teacher salaries are $45,000 to $49,000. And so you're going to have to compete to get those teachers to stay in your community. And then you also need to pay for extras. STEM, science, technology, engineering, and math. It is the future. It is very, very expensive to have that experiential learning for students. The labs, the equipment, and the curriculum are all very pricey. One time it was $20,000 just to outfit one anatomy unit at our high school. I had squirreled away some money in an account that nobody knew about, and when the teacher came to me and pleaded, I said yes, because I had this money I'd set aside for those cases. But you can't do that in every building, in every school in your district, because that can add up to hundreds of thousands of dollars to run those programmings. And another thing which I believe in, and I think most people in education will believe, is field trips are great. Kids learn by doing. We know this. And you want kids to experience. And to do that, you have to pay for buses and transportation in a school shortage of bus drivers. And so you have to pay your bus drivers more to keep them, or they're going to get poached by every district around you. And when that happens, that also causes increases, and that's another reason why you might need a referendum. So Monroe County, in their case, yeah, they're probably going to say, we need that. Don't be surprised if you see the referendum language on a ballot coming up, because they have one that's expiring. But they still want to keep programming, and they also want to kind of work with this 8th lowest tax rate in the state. There's sometimes you want to be, cheap. If anyone knows me, they know I'm probably one of the cheapest people you will ever meet and most frugal. I love Aldi for that reason and Goodwill. But I'm not cheap. I wouldn't be bragging about having the 8th lowest tax rate. Because in this instance, it's forcing the community into asking for a referendum, and I do think that is something that's really important to think about and go into it.
So if you have the referendum money that's in this separate pot, how do you decide how much of it is going into the other pots?
Because you have to build a referendum budget,
Okay.
and then you have to, like one district that I did consulting for, they actually identified which teachers would get paid out of the referendum. So when they hired new teachers to keep class sizes at their targets, that was one of their referendum goals, was to keep their class sizes at 20 in kindergarten. Every time they hired a new kindergarten teacher for class sizes, that teacher got paid out of the referendum. And then you also now moving forward, are going to have to do reports to the state about how you spend your referendum dollars. Now, charter schools. Real short slide. Charter schools are here to stay. I'm sorry. I know a lot of you don't like them, but they're here. They're in the budget. They receive state tax dollars. So remember, income taxes, sales taxes are what pay for charter schools. There's almost 8,000 students are charter school students in the state. There's 78 school corporations. So charter schools technically are going to be called a school corporation. They are, I did a double take because I didn't think I had my, place value matters for this former math teacher. And it really is $202 million. $202 million. Goes to these 78 charter school entities. And the base amount is $7,000. You're going to notice it's about $700 more than the average that goes to a public school. And that's because a few years back they were voted a premium because they don't get property tax money. So they get some money for capital improvements. They receive no local property tax dollars. So it's not like I would ever want you to go to a charter school board meeting and say, my tax dollars, because that would not be a true statement, because they really don't get any tax dollars to support them. And then private schools, again, tax dollars, so no property taxes, and they're in the form of choice scholarships, 36,000 students almost, so it's much more than charter school students get choice scholarships. And they were $170 million. And there were, again, no local tax dollars. And I'm just sharing those slides with you because I think it puts it in perspective, the sheer number, when you look at something in the collective. It is quite staggering or jaw-dropping, as I would say. That is all I have on my prepared. I could talk forever because I was a classroom teacher and I learned to talk over middle school boys and girls, one, as a form of survival, and two, I love to hear myself talk because I have a Kelly business degree and that's the first thing they teach you. So I'm going to stop talking so that I can answer.
I'll represent your typical middle school student here.
Okay. That is okay. I love questions. I never met a question I didn't like, so please ask your questions. Or if you don't want a question and you want to just, yeah.
I've noticed a lot of athletic facilities at public schools being sponsored by hospitals, doctors, and so forth. And I'm just curious, like, how that all works with private funding and if that's something that public schools could do outside of the athletic arena.
Absolutely. It's donation money. It's designated donations. So you would just, like a hospital, I know a lot of hospitals sponsor athletic facilities. And you would enter into a memorandum of understanding, usually after you've done, you've kind of, quote, bid it out. And they agree to give you so much money over so many years to have their name marketed on the placement on the product or on their, on their football field maybe, or your soccer stadium. And in exchange, that money goes into a designated donation fund and is used for whatever the district and the donor have agreed to. But you could do it for auditoriums. You could do it for STEM labs. I think you have a great, I think, was it Upland that built that mobile STEM lab with IU? I think maybe some
STEM to them.
Yeah, STEM to them. So I think there's lots of companies that will do that. We had, when I was a superintendent, we had Chrome carts, which were expensive, and we had businesses that donated Chrome carts, and we gladly put their sticker on it because I didn't care. I don't care what your sticker says. If I can get 20 Chromebooks to kids, and every year we get them cycled, so they're getting the latest technology. I was on board with that. So you can see it anywhere. It's just people tend to like the flashy and the bright, and it.
So no restrictions, like they can pay for salaries.
I've never seen it done that way, and I don't think they could pay for salaries. I think there's because that has to be collective bargained.
I have a question about complexity.
Oh.
Is it getting better or worse in regards to this?
The amount?
Getting the difference in amount from district to district getting closer and closer. Is that a good thing or a bad thing?
You're getting less and less for students in poverty.
Mm-hmm.
So if you believe every student should get the same amount, it's getting better. If you believe that certain students require more dollars to educate because they come with unique circumstances that require more intensive staff to help them through that. For example, an English language learner student. A student comes in, they might need a lot of individual specialized tutoring to do language acquisition skills. You're seeing less dollars in complexity.
And that's part of the complexity formula, right? It's not, when you talk about complexity, it's not strictly income level, right?
It's income level for the most part. It's the ELL is not funded in it like it should. And there's been, if you follow, when the next year is the biennium, so I think it's going to be like, it is going to be a cockroach fest. I mean, they're going to just turn the light on and you're just going to see them scatter because everybody's going to be wanting money. So it's going to be, it's always fun to watch the legislature, and so you're going to see a lot of arguing between schools, between public schools. You will see your growing schools advocating for equal dollar amounts. You will see your urban and rural schools advocating for more complexity. You'll see schools that have large populations of ELL learners trying to get added to the formula in a different way so that it captures more of the funding, because that does not always get captured. Yeah.
So kind of maybe connected to that, so, and maybe I don't understand, but if is the charter school number based on the per pupil rate in Indiana plus some other stuff, so I guess like would certain people want to, besides, if certain schools are not taking people that would have complexity, then they would be more in favor of getting rid of complexity and per pupil? Is this what I understand?
Yeah. And I think you're going to see that it follows income lines too. So a lot of schools that have low poverty rates also have low special education rates, which is all that you can data mine that on InView. So inview.in.gov, I think is the website. And you can pull up every district in the state, and you can look at the percentage of their population in poverty and in special education identified, and ELL. And so you can kind of get an idea. You can check and see if they have growing enrollment. And so you kind of know who the players are going into it.
But is that charter number based on the same thing that everyone else gets plus something?
They get a little plus something, and that is for the property tax. It's for capital that they don't get. They're in the student transfer game. Charters are really a non-player. The biggest player in the poaching of ADM from one school to the next is a nearby public school. So more students go from one public school to another public school than go to a charter. And there's a great report out on the DOE website that you can get to, and it shows you by school district where everybody who lives in your district as a student, where they go. And that is worth a deep dive into that data to see who's losing students to other public schools and who those public schools are. Other questions? Yes?
Have you boiled that down to the net loss or gain between what happens when students go to charter schools?
I have not. There's Michael Hicks at Ball State. They just did a big report on ADM changes, and I think if you were to Google him, you could find that. It just came out in the last 2 weeks. It's on my summer list to look at which public schools get the largest influx of students and which public schools lose the largest number of students, both gross number and percentage change. Because I think it would be surprising, because everybody thinks that students are charters are capturing the largest number. And you saw the number, it was close to 8,000. And there are far, far more students that are going from one public school to another public school in the state.
Going from public to private with choice scholarships.
With choice scholarships, yeah, close to 38,000. That is a big number too. Yes.
Was the $202 million going to charter schools for the 2021 school year?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. And I pulled that. There's a source on. I pulled that off of one of the state websites. That DOE has a tuition report, and it'll tell you how much goes to each charter school and each public school, how much they get in tuition support dollars. You can pull that chart. Any final questions? Yep.
All right, so when you talk about equality and equity, and you look within a school district, the differences between schools, and you obviously may want more resources to go to the schools that are less well endowed. But when you look at a whole state like Indiana, the whole system of referenda creates tremendous inequalities between districts, so it's maintaining an inequitable state system. And that's a major issue.
It is a huge issue. And I think the best illustration of that is to do a driving tour. And just get your map out and look at a small rural district in Indiana that has under 1,000 students, and then find the nearest suburban district to them and drive around and look at their facilities. And it is light years difference. And it is a lot of it is tied to referendum
Couldn't
dollars.
you also say it's a matter of sheer numbers? I mean, aside from what the
Absolutely.
ADM is, that if you're able to concentrate 4,000 students, you got that much more compared to even in rural districts that have consolidated. You're lucky if you get a high school up to 1,500 students or something like that, you could just build a much bigger stadium because you just got that many more
Yeah,
students.
absolutely. And you also have overhead costs, that old business principle, get distributed per person. So, when you're paying your superintendent total compensation package, maybe it's $200,000, which sounds like a lot of money. But if you have 6,000 students and you divide it by that 200,000, that's a lot less than the 90,000 you're paying a superintendent in a rural district that has 750 students. And so that's the other thing that we're seeing is you still have to have a school nurse, and that overhead's getting divvied up between a lot fewer people. You still have to have a guidance counselor. And so there are challenges, yes.
What's happening to the appraised valuation around the state, especially in the rural areas? Up, down?
I think it depends on if it's tied to farmland or not. Farmland had decreased the last couple of years. I think it's stable for this year going into this budget. So I think it's tied to that. I think it's also tied to the amount of housing, because I know my own housing went up quite a bit. It went up like 40% this year because it's based on real market value. So a lot of people were seeing large increases in their assessed value of their own homes. I always tell people, watch, you're probably going to get a big tax bill. So this might be a windfall year for schools because they're able to collect more in their operations fund if they keep the rate the same. So that it just depends on the makeup in the district. If you're farmland heavy, it's probably not growing. But if you're in a rural area, maybe like a Lake Wawasee, that has a lot of vacation homes in it, and the value of those homes are going up, you might see that also increasing.
Yeah, if you could wave your magic wand and fix education funding in Indiana, what would it be? What would that goal be? And then what would, you broke that down into several baby steps that citizens or voters should take to get there. What might those steps be?
I think there's two fundamental things that come to mind. The first thing I think of is, having worked at State Board of Accounts, and I think public accountability for tax dollars is crucial. And so I think anybody that gets tax dollars for students should have to have a public audit of records. And that's just transparency and funding. And that is something that both sides of the political table should agree to. To me, it's a no-brainer. It is not something that's very popular. No one wants to talk about that, but I think it is crucial that charter schools and any private dollars become audited by public. It's transparency. I think that is super important. I think the other unwritten thing that no one wants to talk about is, at some fundamental level, what is too small of a school to operate, to educate children in the state. And, Indiana forced consolidation in the 50s and 60s. People are still complaining about that. But I think that's another thing that we need to address. How can you have a viable curriculum when you have 250 kids in a high school? How can it be done with fidelity?
We've got these different pressures on schools, so small districts might be under pressure to consolidate, but at the same time we have this open season for charter schools to open up, and that's completely not within the control of a local community.
Yeah.
What impact does that have on that discussion?
It has a big impact depending on how their ADM flows. So if their attendance is decreasing because the charter schools are pulling students out of that district, then they are going to see a substantial amount of funding. Where I was superintendent, we had a net loss of students every year. And it was a combination of public schools and charters. And when you're losing $1 million to other schools, you have to account for that somehow. And so it is complex and it is unique for every district. So there's not one Band-Aid that we can say that this was going to solve the problem, because it's very complex and it's very nuanced.
But it's also hard to argue consolidation when
I-
have 25 children.
Absolutely.
And somehow they have to operate, and they can't provide
Yeah,
much of
it's,
anything.
yeah, it is.
Nurses or counselors, there's,
It is. So it is very complicated, and a lot of people, they just don't understand how schools change today, how it is different, and how, the one-room schoolhouse of 100 years ago, it is very difficult to replicate that with fidelity. And I'm not saying it can't be done, because there are always anomalies, and there are always people that can do that. But I do think that it is very challenging with the cost of maintaining facilities and maintaining equipment and curriculum and technology in order to fund it at the level it needs to be. Yep.
I don't think you've covered this. If charter schools don't get property taxes, how do they cover their overhead and their?
They pay for them out of the extras that because the charter school funding goes to, they have these contracts, these operating contracts with overseers. So they kind of go in through a back door in order to fund them.
The fact that we have such a low property tax rate here, is there, and this is kind of a little bit of getting away from finance, but who sets those rates? Because I'm thinking about here, like, okay, referendum versus let's just.
You can't legally. So you cannot increase the rate for the operations fund. You just can't do it. It's set by law how much it can go
No,
up.
but the fact that we said we have the 8th lowest.
Right,
tax
and
rate,
that's
just because of that. That's something that's not set by us. That's
yeah, that's set by, that's tied to state law and how much you can increase it.
So it's a 1-2 punch.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, if in a crystal ball everybody knew that they were going to change the property tax, rules back in 2008, then 2 years before everybody would have blown up their operations budget and tried to have the absolute highest rates they could so they could have a higher rate moving forward. So you really were penalized if you were frugal and tried to live within your means. From, we're still paying for that about 15 years later.
This is a political statement. On the screen, you were showing about $376 million going to charter schools and voucher schools. That money is coming out of the budgets of regular public schools. There's a little twist that I throw in to that argument, especially for the vouchers, that as was noted somewhere, most of the voucher schools are religious schools. You pointed out that the money that used to go to, I forgot the terminology, but in the IPS Fort Wayne.
Complexity, yeah.
Was for inner city schools, where some of the toughest kids, it's a tough neighborhood. And I was in 50 of the IPS buildings at one point, so I understand some of that. But basically, the voucher schools are taking money out of the poorest communities in the state, excluding the rural areas, which seems to be a contradiction with these alleged religious schools taking money from the inner city, allegedly poor neighborhoods. Is that a fair statement, which creates a value judgment by your part, I know?
It does. And so I'm probably going to deflect and let you read between the lines and decide for yourself what you think, where you stand in the whole voucher private discussion. Final questions? Thank you very much. You've been a wonderful audience. Appreciate it.
if this is on, but, oh, there it is. Thank you all for coming tonight. We are, as I said earlier, a grassroots organization. We are propelled by just membership dollars. Our dollars go to support local activities and also pay for our lobbyist at the State House. Please think of joining us. You can find that in our program and go to our website at keepeducationpublic.org. I do want to say something about the love of buildings and this resistance to consolidate. In regards to the Unionville School, there was a great history, and I shared it in our last month's, or this month's 5 Things, our email. And it tracks the history of the Unionville area from like the very beginning, and there were all these schoolhouses. And bit by bit, schools burnt down and they consolidated, or they just consolidated, but often it was like schools were burning down. And they're like, oh, that one burned down, we'll rebuild, but then the next time it burns down, they consolidated. So I feel like, although we do love our buildings and we are resistant to change, there is some sort of change happening in the past. Like we have been in Indiana consolidating for a very long time. It wasn't just in the 50s. And we are still consolidating now, and it's all for the better, and it's for the purpose of educating our future the best way we can. But I want to thank you for coming. This has been very educational, and I want to thank everybody else for coming and staying awake because this is hard stuff to understand. I wish you all well, and good night, and Monday is almost done.